Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 4 of Sound Matters. And this is our first podcast of 2026. I'm Chris Munro.
I'm Simon Hayes. Chris and I are both production sound mixers. We're very fortunate today. We've got a special guest, Angus Munro, who's been in the cutting room for more than 15 years. He started off in post-production sound, but he's been in the picture editing side of things, as I say, for longer than 15 years. He's an associate editor and a post-production supervisor. And we've brought Angus in today because we thought it'd be interesting to have a conversation about the integration between production sound, the relationship, the collaboration between our brothers and sisters in the picture editing room. Of course, we've got to supply great sound for Avid. That's as important as supplying great sound for our sound editing team in Pro Tools afterwards. You know, there is that link in the chain that often doesn't get spoken about enough. So it's going to be really great to get Angus's input. Welcome, Angus.
Thank you very much. Thanks for having me.
I think, Simon's probably hit on exactly what most people would like to hear about. You know, we go on and on about why it's important to get a production mix. When the soundtrack is actually going to be all taken apart in sound post and usually going to be recreated from the ISOs, why do we need to do a great production mix?
Well, I think a great production mix, really helps sort of forge how the film, in an editing process when we're working in a cutting copy, it is all work in progress. However, there's many points along the way where we will do audience recruit previews using that mix track. We would have had sound editors start, but not on for that great amount of time, and they'll be using our Avid tracks to do a temp mix for 200 people, sometimes more, recruit sometimes in the UK, sometimes in the US, sometimes both. So it's really, really important that sounds great, because that is what is going to be shown along the way in the editing process. It's also really important because that track also is going to be used when the lab or the cutting room create the clips for the dailies clips for Pix or other sort of dailies file sharing platforms. So when creatives are looking at that and studio execs are watching that, it's got to be good to be able to hear the dialogue clearly, and really understand what's going on. Anything that's not great on that track, is going to be flagged. It's going to require a lot of work. And to be honest, it depends on if you have a good cutting room, they can, and good assistants, they can help you, kind of tidy up a mixed track if it's okay. But, you don't want to rely on that. You want to be providing something that is good from the offset to kind of eliminate that chance of it not getting cleaned up and not, helping the sound along the way.
What I always think, Angus, is that production mix that we do is there to create confidence for the director and for the producers, for the studio execs. The problem is, if the production mix isn't working, even if there's some gold in the ISOs, they're not interested in waiting and worrying about whether it can be cleaned up. They're going to start, even if it's subconsciously, thinking, we're going to need to loop that. And once they start talking about ADRing a scene, that almost is a little bit like a snowball rolling down a mountain. It gathers momentum. And then even if a dialogue editor can clean up, often the director started making plans about what he's going to do differently in ADR. And so I almost think that production mix is really, it's a statement and it's a placeholder to say these are the great performances you've got and it's going to get even better. I think if the production mix suffers, you've got suddenly people concerned about the sound even when it can be cleaned.
Absolutely. No, I couldn't agree more. And I think also with a sort of post-production supervisor's hat on, I think that, what happens is that, budgets and sound bids and everything like that are all locked way before production starts. So there's only there is a certain amount of days that are booked, for cast and not necessarily booked, but budgeted for, and time, studio time and that kind of thing. And I think that, going along shooting it thinking, no, we're just going to loop, we're just going to ADR this, we run into real serious problems in post because we don't have the money to do that. We don't have the time to do that. That money can't just be found. And also, cast availability is really tricky. It's really, really tricky getting these guys in. They don't always want to do it. Some are great. Some, really get into it. Some are really hesitant about doing it. They haven't played that character that they were, or that role that they were playing for, sometimes even a year later. So if they're a method actor like we've had before, that they to get back into that, they need a lot of time and they need the lines, and they can just be really tricky getting them in when they want to be. So it's not as simple as saying, oh, we'll just ADR that later. It just doesn't work that way. And I think that's a kind of misconception with a lot of people thinking that it all can just be fixed later on with sound. There's a lot of time when directors are talking over takes, the actors, which is, I get it. They want to have a good performance, and it is a lot harder to fix a performance in camera than it is sound, which is the mindset of a lot of people. And not just a director, just, a lot of people on set, ADs, lots of people kind of think that it can all just be tidied up or cleaned up a little bit with visual effects. They think a lot of things can just be fixed in post. And yes, they can to a certain degree, but unless you've got that base level of a decent soundtrack, a decent level of, what's in camera to start with, of good foundation, if you haven't got that, it's really hard, and it can look and sound eggy. It's just, you're fighting it.
I think you make you've underlined something Simon said is about capturing performance. I mean, we tend to always feel that rather than just capturing sound, we're actually capturing a performance. And that's an important part of what we do, is making sure that the actor's whole performance is going to be in the final film, everything they've kind of worked on. But one of the things, it is a performance, and we have to have some headroom in our recording. We generally tend to record maybe at -10 or even -20, because we don't know when there's going to be screams. We don't know what's going to happen. We need to give ourselves some kind of backup. And because it's digital recording, it doesn't matter. Now, the Avid Media Composer doesn't always deal very well with this. You're getting all your other tracks in, maybe tracks from libraries, at really high levels. Often the sound effects, often the music is at 0 or even +10. What that means is, I've often had cutting rooms come back to me and say, oh, the dialogue is very low level. Can you give me more level?
Yeah.
And so, what I tend to do is I tend to boost my left mix track by 6 dB. Is that a problem, or does it help?
No, it's great, and I see this all the time. With people, what they do is they're bringing in their sound effects, they're bringing in their temp music scores, which, like you say, are all kind of at 0 dB. And then they're using the gain tool within Avid, which can only you can only raise it by 10 dB in Avid. You can use a plugin, you can overboost it if you want, but then you get into distortion, it sounds terrible. And what tends to happen is when people are mixing in the Avid for the cutting track, which is, again, going back to using your mix track, using that as a base, and then you're adding all your sound effects and your music underneath that in your timeline. And when it comes to a screening, or even just an output, even just doing an output for Avid that someone's going to watch on their laptop or what have you on Pix, you have to go through the whole film, bolt it together, do a mix within the Avid and get it all sounding right. And yes, we do kind of make sure that the dialogue is always heard over sound effects and music. You always want to, especially if someone's watching it on a laptop, which is kind of, trying to get all of that sound and all those things working together to come out of tiny little speakers on a laptop is tricky. So we always make sure that the dialogue is always, up slightly higher in the mix. But what I see a lot of time with a lot of assistants and editors is that they use their sound effects and their temp music score as the base level rather than the mix track. What tends to happen is they go, oh, I can't hear the dialogue, push. And then when you look at the mixer, the digital mixer within Avid, and you see that every bit of every dialogue, every cut and every section is all at like +10, and then they go, we can't hear it because you run out of headroom. So I think it's, it's really important that people in the cutting room understand that they should be using what you supply as the base, and then they need to actually, you can easily just do it on a setting. So everything that you pull in, you can actually set it so that when you pull it in, it drops everything down by 10 dB. You haven't got to do it manually. It's very simple. You can do that, and then you've got all the room to play with. But we also struggle with, like, a lot of composers send their temp score sometimes at plus 10 dB, but that's because they want their music heard. They're not silly. They know what they're doing. And a lot of the time we ask for composers to send their tracks back, or go to the music editor. And a lot of the time, music editor will chase through the cut and see where he needs to dip it, where he needs to mix it, where he needs to get it to hit, and everything like that, which is great. But the problem with that, with for an editor's point of view, is that if they are then recutting that scene and they're leaving that music in situ where those points were, and they've moved the hit point, over here, over there, they will just literally cut and splice up that music track to follow those points, and then just do a crossfade and mix it in. But if you've got automation on there and the levels are up there, it doesn't work. So we actually often always ask for the music to come back from the composers at just with no automation, so that we can fix that in the Avid ourselves. Yes, it requires a lot more work, and I think this is another thing. I think assistants and editors sometimes kind of think, I'm only there to put the picture together and export it and get it out to people and that. But there's so much more really that you should be doing in order to kind of build it and make it almost feel like a finished film at every step of the way.
That's so interesting, Angus, because this is something that you and I have spoken about on jobs that we've done together before. And there's a couple of points here which are really pertinent. One is using the production sound mix track as the base level, and then instead of trying to increase gain there with limited headroom, turning down the effects and the music tracks and using the production sound as your master, if you like, and bringing everything down. So much easier, so much more ability to come down rather than up. I would say right now, currently, I'm working with two types of picture editors, two types of picture editing teams. There's the ones who would like me to push the dialogue, and just like, it's funny, Chris, you mentioned 6 dB. That's exactly what I've arrived at. That seems to be the sweet spot. I would say that the picture editors that have said to me, a little bit low, could you give me a bit more? What they're talking about is a 6 dB boost. So what I've started doing is at the start of the film is talking to picture editorial, whether it's the first assistant editor or whether it's the picture editor themselves, it doesn't matter. It's whoever's really kind of in charge of the sound, whoever's the most interested in sound on that team, and saying, look, would you like a plus 6 dB boost into the mix? And 50% of them are saying yes. The picture editors that are saying no are generally picture editors that love to go fishing in the ISOs. Not necessarily because there's a problem with the mix, they just are really, really into sound. And they like to go exploring. If we've put a boom in the mix, they like to have a listen to what the radio's like, potentially say, oh, I quite like that close-up, really close-up sound on that line of dialogue, and suddenly they've dragged in that ISO of that line. Now, the problem is when we put 6 dB of boost into the mix track, that ISO now isn't going to line up. So they would prefer to have the production mix at exactly the same level as the ISO. So when they go fishing, it all lines up beautifully. What I would urge production sound mixers who are getting into this and starting to, if you're getting asked by a picture editorial team to up your levels, my strong advice is only do it on the mix track, don't do it on the ISOs, because if you start boosting the levels on the ISOs and someone screams and you're suddenly hitting the end stop, then really we've thrown the baby out with the bathwater. And it really is our primary job to protect those ISOs and to make sure that they're clean. We're not smashing into a compressor limiter for the dialogue editor. And finally, based on what Angus has just said, just something else I'd like to say. And you can correct me if I'm wrong, Angus, but I think that Avid mixes are getting better. I think that Avid, that picture editorial teams are also generally getting better at dealing with sound. And we're seeing a lot less temp mixes being required early on. And that Avid mix is almost becoming the temp mix. Of course, on huge movies, the temp mix is still happening, but it's not happening straight away because the Avid mix is actually sounding great. And so that's why we've got to really take that Avid mix seriously, because it's not like when I started, when you would know that 1 week after principal photography ends, they're going to be in temp mixing. Now that Avid mix is it's going to live and go out to all of the studio execs. It's going to go into smaller audience test screenings, and that time between you don't want to temp mix until really you've started getting close to picture lock. And so all of those early test screenings, you're nowhere near picture lock, and so that Avid mix is golden. Would you agree with that?
100%. I mean, the general sort of scheduled timeline really for a movie is like you have a 10-week director's cut after you finish principal photography. So within that 10 weeks, that's the time that it all comes together, and the editor's working with the director, and we are sending, when we get towards the end of that, the studio expects to see a director's cut. Now, along the way, you generally wouldn't have had a sound team on at that point. So this is the chance for the director and editor to get their version of the film that they actually believe should be the final version of the film to a degree. I mean, obviously they want input and what have you. So it's really important that the first time you're showing the studio your cut of the film and your version of the film, that it not only looks good, it sounds good, and you kind of get, because there's so much work that goes on with sound in terms of creatively setting the narrative, and you can be really clever. There's a lot of scenes, especially if you're in a big scene where it's a big wide scene. Say you're at a big there's like a sort of big banquet or something like that, and you're as an editor, you're starting wide, and then you're coming in and you're going to individual characters of what they're doing, what they're saying. Now, it's really important to be able to set that so that you get the sense that you're starting wide. There's no point in being on an ISO, for instance, on someone talking and not hearing the wideness and the size of the room and the sort of dynamic and the scope of that. So there's lots of things that you have to do in editorial and picture editorial to kind of help that, and to kind of really, ultimately you're trying to make it look and feel real. And I think it's really important that from a picture editing point of view is that you're not just there to sort picture. You're there to music's just as important. Sound is important. It's all important. Even visual effect, getting the good temp visual effects. It's all these kind of things, like I say, to kind of make it feel as finished as it possibly can every step along the way.
You mentioned there something which is kind of interesting, is about the different levels, the way that, when it's going to be wide or tight or so on and so forth. Mm-hmm. One of the things that both Simon and I will remember when we first started mixing is we were mixing to a single track. So the production mix we did couldn't be undone. And one of the key things that we used to really concentrate on was matching levels. We'd be paying attention to the background, but we'd always, we would always try to make sure that every take, the levels matched so that they could be intercut. Does that still apply?
The continuity is the continuity in sound is one of the biggest things that, if you don't have it, you struggle with it in the cutting room, because what you end up having to do, let's say, for instance, take 2 has the perfect, level, and, it's what you kind of want. But, obviously an editor's using different takes here, there and everywhere. And what you end up having to do, if there is no continuity between take 3 and take 2, for instance, you'll end up having to kind of lip sync using take 2 and fudge it, get it just, you might lose a bit of lip sync because obviously it's a different performance each time. And so getting that continuity between every take is so important. Like, it just really helps an editor to be able to just go, I can just use any take, and I can use the mix track from that take, chop it in, and it all just sounds, it flows.
And just for me to jump in on that, and I could, as usual, I could speak for an hour about this, but I won't. I think that there's something very, very important that Chris just said, that when we started, Chris, we were mixing to with me, it wasn't actually a single track, it was 2 tracks, but it was a Nagra 1/4 inch analog tape. So what we had to do, we had to make sure that we lined up the 4 ppms on our mixer to hit -4 dB analog on the Nagra, and so because we knew that if we recorded too low, it would be unusable because there'd be tape hiss all over it. If we recorded too high, we'd be squaring off, and there would be no way of going into the ISOs and rebuilding that mix, as you said. And so really we were living and dying with the levels, and we had to have continuity, because if we didn't, our sound was unusable. And I worry that in the modern day, when you have production sound mixers that didn't start in that scenario, they've started using multi-track. They've come into the industry using a fader surface rather than a mixer. They have missed out that very, very important education that we got, which is level matching and making sure that we have the correct levels and then they're not wavering. And I think, as Angus says, it's a real problem. If your mix track doesn't cut together, it's not going to sound good. Even if you've got great ISOs and you've got really, really good tracks, if every time there's a cut, it draws the audience's attention to what the picture editor has done. First of all, it's embarrassing for the picture editor, because it's saying, hey, I've cut to the close-up. Hey, I've cut to the mid-shot. It should be the sound should be absolutely seamless. And so what I would say to anyone listening to this who's right at the start of their career, don't use the faders too much. Choose a level for a scene and stick to it. It's almost like saying, I've made my bed on this scene and I'm going to sleep in it now. Halfway through the scene, you shouldn't be thinking, well, I thought they were going to shout and this is a little bit lower level, so I'm going to stick 8 dB into everything. That's when problems start. Let's use the fact that we've got digital recording, and that if you are recording slightly lower than you should be, you can send a note to the picture editor and the picture editorial team and say, look, that scene was recorded a little bit lower, but what I wanted to do was to give you dialogue continuity, and so I didn't start boosting things. Now, obviously, that's within reason. You don't want it to be really, really low, but what I don't think people should be doing is chasing their levels around and trying to make every take a different level, because you've got to you're thinking, oh well, I can make that louder, I can make that softer. Start to think about what that's going to sound like when it's cut together. Would you agree with that, Angus?
100%. And I think the same kind of method can be applied to so many things when making films. I mean, you've got to commit. If you find if that's where you're at, anything creatively, if that's where you've got to go with it. If you're forever chasing your tail, no films would ever get made. An editor has to commit, has to say, this is how I want it, and a director, the performances on, with actors in production. I think you're absolutely right, Simon. I think if leaving the faders alone, keeping it to a point where it's the same throughout, it makes it a lot easier for us to be able to fix things in post, as it were. With again, going back to that foundation, if the foundation is good, then it's easier to kind of manipulate it and tweak it and polish it up. Whereas if you're forever up and down, we're forever chasing our tail in the cutting room. And what tends to happen is there's kind of a bit of an easy cheat sometimes, is that you can dip into the ISOs and then you can just use the ISOs throughout the whole scene for everyone. But then, as you know, you've got this very close up, no dynamic, no scope sound that is then as an editor or an assistant is going to have to do is they're going to have to fill that scene with Foley. They're going to have to fill that scene with so many more Atmos sound effects, and again, then we get into the process then of just having this huge stack of tracks just to kind of get you back to where you should be, not even getting into anything creative. You're just trying to get back to where it should be, but it's not great.
That's really interesting, what you say about the kind of radio mic sound. Now, one of the things that we have is that we are listening on headphones.
Yeah.
And one of the things I always say to people is you must, from time to time, go and listen to your tracks on speakers in a cutting room, in a room, because often you can get what we used to call radio mic ear, that the radio mic track actually sounds better to you because you're listening to it in this enclosed space. And when you start to hear the boom tracks, they don't sound as good and you lose confidence. It's really important that we realise that the headphones are just a kind of a guide. And what we really should be looking at is how things sound in a theatre on big speakers.
It's interesting because no editor would sit cutting a film with headphones on. They just would. It's very rare that you would listen to it with headphones on. I don't know. I haven't done a lot of high-end TV jobs, so I don't know whether that kind of applies to that, because obviously working in sort of an HDR environment, which is more video type environment, maybe that does happen. I'm not sure, but and sort of going back to assistants that come from TV into film, I think they sometimes don't quite understand what's involved with the sound work in terms of having to kind of mix it and get it to a point, because it is literally just you're on such a tight schedule. It's just get it done, move it out, and then it gets sent to someone else. And it is really much more of a conveyor belt system rather than in the film world, where it's completely different. You're starting it at the beginning and you're seeing it all the way through to the end.
What I try and do, Angus, as you well know, is I'll always get on the dailies list, and there's an unfortunate trend actually that's happening where production sound mixers often aren't getting committed to that list. But what I would say to everyone is get in touch with the producer and say, I need to be watching dailies. And when you're watching dailies, try, if possible, if you've got time, don't just listen to the dailies on your iPhone or on your Apple Mac. Come back and, go and plug your computer in or use AirPlay or whatever and listen to it on your television through whatever you're listening to at home. For me, it's a 5.1 system, even though it's only going to come out the center channel, right? Because then you're kind of listening to how your mix translates onto a speaker, but you're also reminding your ears, as Chris has just mentioned, you're reminding your ears not to get drunk on radio mic sound and not to kind of start to only listen to your recordings based on a set of Sennheiser or Sony headphones, because the moment that dialogue comes out of a speaker and goes into the acoustic of your listening room, it changes. And having that reference, reminding yourself of that reference at least 2 or 3 I know when we're shooting it's tough to watch dailies every night, but at least 2 or 3 times a week I'll go in and spend half an hour, especially if I've had a tricky scene. I'll think, right, I need to have a listen to that because I made some decisions there and I need to make sure that they're the right decisions, so that I'm continually trying to get a little bit better. We all still make mistakes, Chris, don't we?
Of course.
It's funny you mention that, because we do the same thing in picture editorial. Because let's say, for instance, we are getting ready for an audience recruit screening, which is normally done at just a regular cinema. We'll take it over, in the West End or that kind of thing. So what we will try to do, obviously listening to the sound that you get so used to in the cutting room on speakers, but close, we would always take some time to go to that cinema with some test material, maybe a scene here and there, to check colour, to check that kind of thing, for what the picture looks like, but also because the sound is so different. And, a lot of editors will walk in there and go, oh my God, it sounds absolutely terrible. This is because it's not what they're used to listening to. So actually, we have the same thing, in terms of going from a small room to a large room, and then having done that test, we can then go back to the cutting room and go, right, actually, we need to kind of adjust some things here and mix it ever so slightly different, for a bigger room.
I was very fortunate growing up. My dad had a couple of mates that were in the music business, and I spent a couple of weeks listening to an album being made at Chipping Norton Studios when I was about 9 years old. And what I noticed was the mixing engineers and the producers would get the mix to where they thought that they were going to commit to it and sign off on the studio monitors in the studio. And then before they signed off, they'd actually stick it on a cassette tape, go downstairs into the car park and listen to that mix in their cars. And I said, why are they doing that? And they immediately said, because that's how most people are going to listen to this album. And the same applies, what you've just described in the cutting room, the same applies. People are going to listen to that work either in the cinema or on a 5.1 system at home. What we can be sure of is that very, very few people are going to listen on headphones, or hopefully not.
But I mean, that's why when we do the mix, we'll do a theatrical mix, a 5.1, 7.1 Atmos, that kind of mix on the dubbing stage. And then once that's completed, if you are theatrical, delivery, for instance, and then you'll also do a near field mix, which is obviously for home entertainment purposes, and then obviously, and the same for the picture. You grade it differently as you would do for theatrical. So there definitely is, you have to work for two kind of audience settings, in that sense. And as we all know now, most people watch stuff at home. That is the more popular location where people are watching things, which is strange because we, again, with a post supervisor hat on, a theatrical delivery for most of the films that I work on is your hero delivery. That's the one you focus the amount of time on. That's the one that has the most amount of money spent on it, and then the home entertainment delivery is a secondary. But as I say, it's kind of weird because in the real world, most people are watching it at home.
Or on their phones.
Or on their phones or on laptops. All that work you do, and then someone's just got one earphone in and watching it on a train.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. Just going back to the levels thing, again, because I've been doing this for an awfully long time, I still put a tone on the beginning of my day. I put a -20 dB tone on the beginning of my day, so that, or if I change, every time I make I change roles or whatever, I'll put that -20 dB tone on. So then when it goes to the editing room, they can actually see that should read -20 and know what follows. I wonder, do others still do this?
Well, what I can tell you, Chris, is that I still do it as well. If I'm really under pressure one morning, perhaps I won't, but I always try to. It's not as life and death as when we were delivering 1/4-inch tapes, but of course the idea remains the same, and that idea is that our tone shows exactly whether the equipment in the cutting room has been lined up correctly. And let's say someone's knocked a fader or something's gone wrong somewhere. That will immediately be revealed, and what you won't do is have a couple of days of them thinking these levels are all very, very weird, and then notice it's very revealing to have that tone. And what I would also say is there are some cutting rooms, like Angus's cutting rooms, where there is someone who has extreme expertise in sound within that cutting room. There are unfortunately still cutting rooms running where no one really understands sound. It's getting rarer and rarer. Most assistant editors nowadays who have started in non-linear understand, as Angus have said, that sound is an extremely important and valuable part of their job because it's going to make their editors' cut sound better if they're on top of it. But there are still some cutting rooms where sound is secondary, and if those levels get knocked on the little mixer that they're using plugged into their Avid Media Composer, that tone will basically save our bacon as production sound mixers, because what starts happening is there's suddenly a massive email chain going round about a sound problem. And of course, that problem is just that the master levels on a mixer in a cutting room have been knocked and no one's noticed. And in fact, I'm mentoring a couple of young sound mixers at the moment. And one of the things that I've stipulated is you must do an ident and tone every single day. And I've had questions, why? And there you go, that's why.
It's a great insurance policy. It's a great insurance policy for you, really. I mean, but also, we will use it, really all the Avids, should always be lined up. And you can line up an Avid using the onboard, tone generator within Avid, but pretty pointless considering, you again, going back to what we said earlier, using the mix track as your base level, as your foundation. That's what you should be using. So if you've got tone as an ident on there, great. You can just use it anytime. You can pull it up. You can line the Avid up, and because also in an editorial situation, everyone's rooms are different as well. Generally an editor will have the biggest room, because obviously he has to have people in there and he's the editor. But some of the assistants will be in really, really small rooms with the same speaker setups, with the same mixer setup, and of course you can't, someone in a small room, well, firstly, they don't want to annoy the editor, for instance, by playing it at a loud level. So they will be just using their master fader on their mixer thing to bring it right down and have an overall lower level. So I think, be able to have that minus 20 dB that you can line up everyone's Avid to to actually know it's not the monitoring, it's actually what is in the Avid is correct, is really important.
What about sync tests? We always used to do sync tests in the analog days. Are they still helpful?
You have to have a sync test before shooting, prior to shooting. You have to be able to test the pipeline. You have to be able to test the workflow of what, the conversations, that you should have had, workflow calls to discuss all things post, and throughout the whole of production of what affects post, and the colour pipeline, the sound pipeline, all of it has to be discussed, has to be agreed. And then following that, you have to have a sync test, because how do we know that on the first day of shooting it's going to be right? You could effectively lose so much money, so much time by not having the right sound, or not having the right, even things like making sure that we have digislates that work. Making sure that that the time code is jamming to cameras. It's things like that. Not necessarily how it sounds, although that is important. It's the technical side of things that go with that we have to just make sure is right prior to day one of shooting.
Angus, as you know, I'm really into sync tests. I enjoy them, and I just want to talk about the fact that sometimes I'll do a sync test and I will get picture editors come back to me and say that was so helpful and no one's ever done it before. And
really?
Yeah, absolutely. It's incredible. So I just wanted to run through for any production sound mixers that don't do sync tests, and this is really for the guys and girls that are at the start of their career and they're concerned about asking for a sync test, concerned about the work that it entails for the camera department, and asking production whether you can come in and set up in the corner of a studio, how imperative it is, and also how to do it. The first thing is that a sync test shouldn't just be a couple of 30-second clips, right? Especially nowadays where we are going to have directors say, keep the camera rolling, go again, keep the camera rolling, go again. A sync test, like, you should do at least one take in your sync test, which is 6 or 7 minutes long, because that 6 or 7 minutes long will reveal a problem. And if there is a problem, it will reveal where the drift happened. Sometimes you could do a 30-second sync test and it will look okay, and the moment you come to do a 7-minute take with a director, an issue will be revealed. Let me tell you how I like to do it. I get a chair set up and I ask all the cameras to set up focused on the person that's going to be sitting in that chair. They can go wide, mid, close, mid, and close up if they'd like to use different lenses. It doesn't matter as long as you can see lip sync. Now, obviously, all of those cameras should be time code jammed with the locket boxes that you're going to use. But what I also like to do is I'll go and sit in that chair and I will discuss my workflow document, even if it isn't in my head, because it's something a bit different. I'll read that workflow document off a bit of paper off my iPhone. And so what it does is it gives my workflow document will take 5 or 6 minutes to talk about. And so it basically gives 5 or 6 minutes of lip sync of me talking and also articulating and verbalizing a workflow document that, should anyone in the pipeline have not read my sound workflow document, it's a second opportunity for me to get what we're doing across. The other thing that will happen is in my lap, I'll have an open timecode slate. I'll clap that slate when we turn over, but then I'll just leave the sticks open so that as we're rolling, not only have Picture Editorial got that timecode running on the cameras, but we've also got the timecode running on the Digislate, and we've also got the timecode running on the sound recording machine that one of my assistants is running. We'll have a boom, if possible 2 booms, right, working above me, and we'll have a radio mic on me, and maybe a couple of other radio mics just stood by over there, just open so that there's some sound going through all the ISOs, so that you've got a decent number of tracks open, at least 6 or 7, right? And then what I will do is I'll discuss for 6 or 7 minutes, and at the end I'll put an end clap on. Now what this system does is it means that if there is a problem and something's drifting, having that timecode slate and shot for all of that time and all of the other timecode references, we will know immediately. The cutting room will be able to say, it's C camera that drifted, or it's the sound recording machine that drifted. That's a bit strange. Can are you sure that you were on the right frame rate, or whatever it is? Okay, but you will reveal the issues. And just moving on to the next thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is I'm a great fan of using digislates, timecode slates. And the reason is, guys, and Angus will be able to correct me if I'm wrong, nowadays on feature films, and I think on high-end television, we're shooting a whole bunch of stuff at 48 frames per second that frankly, in my opinion, shouldn't be. Okay, it's whole dialogue scenes, and the reason is because the director and the DP have said it might be nice as someone gets up after that dialogue and pushes the chair in for us to go to slow-mo. And if they turn over at 48 frames per second, it's easier for them to do that. So you'll end up shooting a 3-page dialogue scene at 48 frames per second on A, B and C cameras just to capture a potential bit of slow-mo that may be required. Now, when you turn over at 48 frames per second, your on-camera time code isn't working properly because you're not shooting at 24. So if you're using an old-fashioned clapperboard and you haven't got a timecode slate, suddenly there is no belt and braces. The cutting room don't have the camera timecode, and they've got no on picture, no visual timecode on the timecode slate. And so that's one of the reasons why I'm insisting on a timecode slate. Angus, how do you feel about that?
I mean, I would always insist on having digislates. I'm still from a cutting room where we sync ourselves, which I fundamentally believe that is what should always happen in the cutting room. I think, having a lab sync up for you where they don't sync by eye, they just sync by time code, which again goes back to the point where making sure when you're sync test that cameras are jammed to sound and it works, and it's it's basically there's nothing that's going to trip that up, because ultimately a lab won't really they won't check it really. I mean, they will, but this is the middle of the night. They've got a whole bunch of other jobs that they should be doing as well. They can't be sitting there watching every take to make sure it doesn't drift, it doesn't go out of sync, it's not a problem. They'll just literally, sync it, as I say, by time code using a couple of keystrokes, done, and then that will go up onto pics and what have you. That's fine, but I think you're having a digislate for syncing yourself in the cutting room is just fundamentally like your biggest tool in making sure that each camera is in sync and is frame accurate. I think that sometimes where what would be super helpful on slates as well, even on regular slates, is to be able to, because I know that sometimes if it's a big wide shot with cranes and what have you, very, very difficult to sometimes get a board, or you might get a large, the huge boards that aren't digislates, but to ident it, but then we can't ever hear the loader, the clapper loader, identing that through audio. And I think if you've got somewhere, maybe potentially having a very basic radio mic within a clapperboard somehow or close to it, so that we can always pick that up. We can always say, okay, that crane is C camera, that is the and you can work it all out, because syncing up everything in picture correctly, what happens is within the Avid is we will use a tool which groups all those cameras together and groups it together as one take. So for instance, in one take one, you just make that one clip, and then in Avid you're able to cycle through the cameras. The only way that works is if every camera is in sync frame accurately. It's a really useful tool for a picture editor to be able to go, I'm going to lay down the wide and scene on for scene one, take one, and then he can sometimes just, if the performance is what he wants or she wants, it could just literally chop up the same take and just cycle the cameras through. So you've got great continuity. Your sound clip, which will be your mix track, is the same throughout them for every camera, and it's perfectly in sync. And having a digislate to help with that is imperative. Like, you have to have it, you know, even to the point, you know, marking up. It's actually easier to tell if it's not 24 frames, because sometimes on a very wide crane shot or drone, it's actually quite difficult by eye to categorically say what that frame rate is, because we don't only just shoot at 48 or 24. You know, we have 36, we have 128. There's all different frame rates that, you know, if it's not clear what that is and we'll be able to ascertain what that is early on, it can take a long time to just guesswork to get it right.
Just a basic question, which a lot of people may be asking now, who are new to this, would be: should I change my timecode rate when the camera shoots at 48 frames?
No. I mean, I think it's also important for sound mixers to kind of, don't worry if something's shot at 48. You know, it's not like we won't be using any of the sound that you've recorded because you can't sync it up. We would always respeed any frame rate that's not 24 back to 24. So we will respeed the picture always back to 24 frames. Sync up as you would, and then and more often enough, we always use the 24 frame version. And like Simon was saying, you know, if the director did want that, you know, someone that's getting up from the table in slow-mo, very, very easy within the Avid then, just to make a cut, grab that bit, she'd cycle back to the 48 frame version in a couple of clicks, and you can blend that in and it's fine. I think, you know, I can see from both sides. I can see why a lot of directors want to shoot everything at 48, because it's really, really, really difficult. Well, not really difficult, but it never looks terribly good trying to respeed 24 to 48 because you've got a double frames. You know, it always looks a bit, you know, not great. And I think I can see why lots of directors do want to shoot a lot of stuff at 48 to give them that option, because, you know, respeeding to 24 is fine. We're actually just taking some frames. It's not a problem. But yeah, I don't think any sound mixers should ever be worried that their sound isn't going to be used because we're shooting everything at 48, because it will.
Sorry, Simon. I was just going to.
Go on.
Just to carry on, just to point out, but the key point is that we do not change our timecode frame rate. We stick to a 24 frame timecode rate, which is a question I often see asked, and I just wanted to make that clear.
Yeah, no, there's absolutely no need to change the to a 48 frame. I mean, you'd be changing all the time. You know, what about on take 3? They want to shoot 36 or 100. You'd never keep up.
And that brings me on to, Angus, another really important point that you've just made, and that is our sound will be used. Guys, you know, don't have first assistants shouting, "This is MOS." You know, they've got no idea what's MOS and what isn't.
Yep.
We're all there. We're on the movie set. There's a boom there. There's microphones there. There's a sound mixer there. Record everything. You know, the worst case scenario is it's not going to be used. It would be awful to have something happen on camera, even if it's a sound effect. What I can tell you is our colleagues in Sound Post want everything, even if it's just to use as a reference for when they rebuild the sound effect and make it sound even better. But, you know, there really is no reason to have any MOS shots now on a movie. You know, just run whatever's happening as a guide track. And I got to tell you, what I do is I never actually call anything a guide track. For me, it's all sync sound, and whether it's used or not is irrelevant. You know, I want to provide it.
I think it's also, you know, even in not even before it gets to post sound, just in the cutting room, you know, having some room atmos is really, really, really super helpful, because just going back to what we were saying, if you don't have the continuity in your sound mix, for instance, you know, if there is a sort of a discrepancy between the takes, just even having sometimes 5 seconds worth of room atmos from that location that you can just stitch together and make, you know, into a minute long, 2 minute long, and just lay as a bed underneath the dialogue or the mix track helps. You know, you can, you know, because sometimes it's, you know, if there's some, I'm not saying hiss, but if there's some sort of something that's happening in the environment that you're shooting, just to be able to keep that continuity going throughout helps, because you don't get the here and the cuts change. So I think, you know, coming back to what you were saying about shoot everything, you know, getting room atmospheres, getting things like that are really, really super helpful for the cutting room, you know, as well as things that we really, really struggle with is getting the right crowd. Using a sound effects library for crowd sounds a little bit like, I mean, some are okay, but, you don't want it to sound like you're watching a US sitcom, with laughs and, that kind of thing, which a lot of, library stuff is because it's so generic. And I think if there's any way that, a sound mixer can go gather, I know sometimes it's difficult and it's tricky and it's, having a first AD that can help you with things like this is always a bonus. But, being able to gather crowd on crowd days and just saying, can we shoot, some reactions or some low level, sort of murmur and all that kind of thing really, really helps us, really, really helps us.
I wanted to ask quite a technical question about Avid, Angus, and this is something that I come up against probably once every 6 or 7 films, and it's generally when the labs are doing the syncing. However, I don't want to point any fingers. I would just want to get to the bottom of why this happens, and I reckon Chris is going to say that he's come up against it as well. So let's say we've got 4 people in a scene. They're all wearing radio mics, okay? And we've got a couple of booms as well. So there's 6 ISO tracks. We've got 2 booms and 4 radio mics. Now, it may be that for half the scene, all 4 of the actors aren't in the scene. They've gone back to their dressing rooms. What we will do is, let's say it's 1 and 3 that have gone back to their dressing rooms. We will close those tracks so they're not recording. Obviously, apart from anything else, to give the actors who are still wearing their radio mics absolute privacy, which is key, paramount in their dressing rooms, or wherever they're relaxing in the easy up of the side of the set. It's irrelevant. And what I've had a couple of times is picture editors come back to me and say, your ISO tracks are jumping around in Avid. When I've gone into the ISOs to have a listen to them, the character that is on radio mic number 2, when radio mic number 1 is turned off, that radio mic number 2 jumps into the position in Avid that radio mic number 1 formerly inhabited. Now, what I've got to the bottom of is that this is a setting on some types of syncing software that happens in post, and the key word here is interleaving. Could you explain this to us? And could you explain there is obviously some kind of discrepancy between some bits of software that creates this issue?
I will try. Having not ever worked in a lab, I mean, I know the kind of process that they do, and they don't sync in. I mean, some may do, but most don't. They sync in Resolve, or they sync in whatever they're using to process their dailies for mainly for like the uploads to pics and what have you. So I can't speak for how that kind of software works. I've never used it, but I can using the metadata probably doesn't translate as well in that, and so it just sees it as an empty track and it goes, oh, this is a populated track. I'm going to move it up to 1 because that's the one you need. In Avid, when we sync, and this is primarily a lot of the time why we sync, you should be syncing anyway because you've got to watch each take anyway. So you might as well sync it and then watch it. So, and you know that it's done right. And also going back to the 48 frames or the variable frame rate clips is that you want to make sure that the way that you could create what's called a subclip in Avid, which is what the editor used, which is basically a sunk clip, is done in a way so that the editor can very, very simply, just with a couple of buttons, go back to 48 frames and use that. So you kind of want to make all these things work, which you can't get from the lab because they're under time constraints. They've got so much work to do throughout the night, especially if if production have gone over and they haven't got the rushes till midnight. Editorial are going to be in at 8 o'clock going, where's my rushes? And it's quite a lot of work for generally one man or woman to be doing throughout the night, and there isn't the level of of making sure it's all correct and it's right. They just got to get it out the door. And I think I understand what you're saying, Simon, about the tracks moving around a lot of the time. We don't generally tend to have that problem, as I say, because we're syncing ourselves in Avid and we're making sure that whoever is cast number 1 remains on whatever radio mic track you've set, and we will make sure of that. We've got the metadata when it comes into Avid, and you see it in our bin view. You can see which mic is labelled to where and which track it is. And as an assistant, you would always just make sure that it's the same every time. I think generally, again, been kind of fortunate enough to work with sound mixers that we don't really have to dive into the ISOs a tremendous amount of time. If that mix track is great and we will use it, and as I say, the continuity throughout each take is the thing. It's very rare that we have to really go and start unpicking stuff. And actually, if we had to unpick it enough and audition various mics within the timeline along the way, it's not too much of a big deal. I think, as you say, there's lots of editors that do want to go into those ISOs quite a lot. But really, if your mix track is good, you shouldn't have to.
I think I might be able to explain this a little bit more as well, because it's also to do with the way that interleaved polyfiles work. So it's also a polyfile issue. So the way that the polyfiles work is that, let's say, for instance, you're recording 6 tracks and your mix. You end up with an 8-track polyfile. So your first 2 tracks will be mix left, mix right, and then channels 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you end up with 8 channels. Often the confusion for us is that track 1 in the final poly is not what we think is track 1, which would be our first fader. So that's the first confusion that often comes up. But also what happens is those, as Simon says, we're recording those 6 inputs to a polyfile, and we decide for one reason or another to actually disarm tracks 2 and 3. The other tracks will jump up to make a final 6-track polyfile instead of an 8-track polyfile. So they all shunt along. That's kind of the way that polyfiles work. I think that there's a couple of things about this. Is that one thing that you wouldn't want in the cutting room is lots of empty tracks. Mm-hmm. Because if you've got a lot of empty tracks, you wouldn't want to, for instance, not disarm those tracks and just leave them, leave them armed, but with the fader down or something. Mm-hmm. You wouldn't want to do that, because you end up the editor then ends up with so many tracks on a page. You can't get all the same tracks on one page, for example, or whatever. So you don't want a lot of empty tracks. So one of the issues about this is it's just the way that polys work. But I think that the difference in the cutting room is that the way that you will work will be different from the way that Resolve and other programs work in identifying those tracks.
The last time it happened to us, we did a deep dive with the labs, and actually they were able to go into the software that they use to make to sync and present the sound to Picture Editorial Sync, and basically click a button, and it basically, and I think the button was called interleave. I can't remember whether they were turning it on or off, but they clicked the button the other way and suddenly everything was perfect. And radio mic number 1 still was called radio mic number 1. It didn't shunt everything across. All of the metadata remained in the right place. It just looked like it does to us on the set, Chris, which is that we've disarmed a certain track, mm-hmm. which is better for everyone, because of course we should be endeavouring, most of us do, to keep the same actors. Our cast number 1 should generally be on radio mic number 1 through the whole movie, unless there's a specific reason we couldn't do that. Sometimes you have to sway from that, but whenever possible, we'd like people to stay on the same radio mics, because it's better for the dialogue editor. And so I think that it's something that is worth looking into if labs are syncing up, and making sure that your track numbers aren't jumping around, because it can be dealt with. It's just recognising it and making sure that you've got the right settings.
Yeah.
Anything else?
No.
Anything we don't do that you wish we did?
I think just going back to what I was saying, if you can just shoot any kind of, if you've got action vehicles, again, that's such a really hard thing for us to get right using library material. You know, building a car, driving off, you know, you think it's kind of easy, but you know, when you're trying to match cameras and trying to match wides and that kind of thing, just be able to mic up a car, you know, miking up from the exhaust, for instance, you know, not, you know, having a mic inside the car as well, getting the interior, that kind of thing, all those things like that, and as I say, like crowd work, all those things that are so hard to really build right, sound good in the cutting copy, are just such a massive help to the cutting room. Massive help.
Can we just finish on this? I've got a controversial question. It's just an opinion-based question. Angus, how long do you reckon it will be before Avid we start to being asked for 32-bit float files in Avid? What do you reckon?
I don't think there's much of a hunger for it from editorial at the moment. Firstly, I think people don't kind of know what it is, for one. I think also, you know, from a cutting room, I think you've got to kind of keep it on a sort of basic level, as it were, as well. I think once you start throwing lots of different options into the mix, and you know, some people kind of know more about it than others, I think we start to get into some issues and problems. And I think we've got to always remember, actually, as much as we're trying to make the cutting copy is good, it still is a cutting copy. It still is a work in progress. You know, yes, I think obviously the 32-bit float will help certain areas, but I think, you know, that's more. I think it's more helpful to a dialogue editor and post sound team than the picture editorial.
Because I know Chris is championing 32-bit float. I've started copying him and doing bits and pieces here and there, but it's still very much a conversation and a positive for sound editorial. We haven't reached a point where it's imminent in picture editorial.
Not yet. But I mean, you know, I think it just depends on how much it's used and how much people know about it. You know, I don't think it's never going to be a similar thing of moving from working in standard def to high def. You know, that it was never going to. I don't think it's going to get to that point where, you know, it's really super helpful and noticeable, and everyone has to make that move whether they like it or not. But I think if it becomes an industry standard and that's kind of how everyone shoots, then you'd have to. There's no choice. But I can't personally at the moment see how it would really benefit picture post at the moment.
Chris, anything to end on?
No, I would agree with that. And in fact, the way that I'm kind of working at the moment is very much sending a 24-bit files to editorial, but reserving my 32-bit float files for sound.
That's right. And before we finish, you know, anyone that's listening to this and thinking this is interesting, I'd like to hear more about 32-bit float, please go back to Sound Matters 1. Chris and I had a very, very long conversation about it, a real deep dive into Chris's workflow on his last couple of movies where sound editorial have worked completely in the 32-bit float domain. Exciting stuff. Angus, thank you so much. It's been a real pleasure having you on. I've asked a load of questions that you know we've had time to ask. It's often very difficult to have the time to spend with someone who's got your knowledge and expertise, and I'm sure it's going to be super interesting for all of our listeners.
I hope so. No, it's been good. Thank you very much for having me.
No, thank you. And for our listeners, just to say that in our next episode, we're going to be talking to a dialogue editor and trying to pose these similar questions about, you know, what they would like us to be doing, which may be different to what the picture cutting room wants.
Angus, Chris, thank you very much, and to everyone else, see you next time.